Hi, everyone. My name is Jenny Castillo, and I am the Regional Engagement Director for the Southern Economic Advancement Project, SEAP for short. We are the organization that translates policy to the South, but also we bring policy to the people. Today, we are happy to again partner with NCOC and Fair Count to bring the final installment of the Pandemic to Prosperity South to you for this year. Today's conversation will be recorded and streamed on our Facebook page. We will be hearing from Stacey Abrams, NCOC, Groundwork Collaborative, and Fair Count. Please note you can use the chat feature of today's webinar to introduce yourself and to ask any questions about the presentations. We will also have a Q&A later in the program, so make sure that you are putting your questions in the chat. To kick us off, we have a special presentation and video from our Executive Director, Stacey Abrams. Please wait as I share my screen to show you the remarks.
Thank you so much for joining today's conversation about how we move from pandemic to prosperity. In 2020 and 2021, we watched as a nation grappled with a pandemic, with a disease that has ravaged communities and revealed, unfortunately, so many of the inequities that have existed for too long. In the South, that conversation has been even more dire. The death rates, the hospitalization rates, and the broken pieces of our infrastructure have shown that there is much work to be done in the South. But we have also seen innovation and we've seen persistence. And we know that if we put our minds to it, if we take the learnings we have from these past 2 years and couple it with the insights we have gained, we can build for a stronger tomorrow across the South. That's our mission. And that is why SEAP and our partners are so excited about this work. And we're excited to share our findings with you. I want to share some of the top takeaways. Number one, we know that while Delta variant cases are dropping, hospitalization rates remain high. And for Black people in the South, they are twice as likely to be hospitalized than white people. We know that nearly 70% of Southerners, in addition to grappling with the pandemic, have also experienced natural disasters over the last 18 months, compared to only 55% of non-Southerners. The South has lost 1.2 million jobs since February 2020. But we also know that 1.2 million working parents reported being unable to find a job because of childcare limitations and cost. As early as September of this year, this remains a challenge. We have an opportunity in this moment to address the challenges that we face, to anticipate what can come next, and to work hard to make it so. By bringing together practitioners, policymakers, and leaders, understanding community and understanding possibility is who we are, and it's what we do. We invite you to join us in this conversation, to look at the resources we're providing, and to join us in creating opportunities and creating new plans for success. We can move from pandemic to prosperity in the South, but only if we have your help. Thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy the presentation.
Thank you so much to Leader Abrams and to you all for being here. We appreciate your attention and also your trust in welcoming these conversations for the last year that we've been talking about this. It is our pleasure to welcome the team presenting the Pandemic to Prosperity report. Dr. Allison Plyer is the Chief Demographer of the Data Center in New Orleans and co-author of Pandemic to Prosperity. Alysha Rashid, who is a policy and data consultant with a focus on building a more equitable society, and Taylor Savell, who is a policy and research analyst at the National Conference on Citizenship, where she is focusing on 2020 census issues such as data quality and the use of census data for redistricting and federal funding. Please welcome them to the stage.
Thank you so much, Jenny. And many thanks to Stacey Abrams for those inspiring remarks. We also have some news about our colleagues, Dr. Janine Abrams-McLean, who was named this week as the president of Fair Count. She couldn't be with us today, but we're sending her our congratulations. And this is our first Pandemic to Prosperity presentation without my co-author and co-creator and friend, Denise Ross. She's moved on to some big things, which you'll hear about soon. And to mark her departure, we put together some short lessons on using data for equitable recovery that we learned starting after Hurricane Katrina and continuing through this pandemic. And it's at pandemictoprosperity.org. And I think Alysha is going to put that in the chat for you. Denise's departure comes with some significant silver linings. She'll be in a position to make some of the changes we've all been calling for in terms of data for equity. And I hope and firmly expect she'll be representing the US public at some future Pandemic to Prosperity report briefings. And there will be future Pandemic to Prosperity reports with support from the Ford Foundation. We will be reporting monthly on national data. And I very much hope Pandemic to Prosperity Report South, which is near and dear to my heart and central to the work here in Louisiana, will continue in some form in the coming year. So on to the report. Pandemic to Prosperity is inspired by a report series we published at the data center here in New Orleans to inform New Orleans post-Katrina recovery. We published it, the New Orleans Index, on a regular basis so that everyone had access to information that tracked rapidly changing conditions and helped to identify priority investments for an equitable recovery. Pandemic to Prosperity builds on this model by bringing together data across silos to help us understand the intersecting impacts of COVID on our communities and our economy, and highlight the obstacles we must overcome for an equitable recovery. For example, and this is echoing some of what Leader Abrams said, until we have sufficient affordable childcare, about more than 1 million women will not be able to return to the workforce. Without Medicaid expansion across the South, rural communities will see more and more hospitals close, depriving them not only of health care, but of major employers. Housing instability caused by massive job loss is being exacerbated now by climate disasters. And all of this is happening as the cornerstones of our democracy are threatened, with restrictive voting laws being passed and public input to redistricting truncated. Please change the slide. Thank you. This slide shows all the indicators in the report, and we've highlighted just the specific data we'll review in this webinar. But do check out the whole report when you can. In the top right corner, you'll see the web address, pandemictoprosperity.org. And the data will be available in a downloadable spreadsheet, which we'll send out as a follow-up email to attendees today. So I'll turn it over to Alysha to present our first indicator covering COVID impacts by race.
Thanks, Allison. As you heard Leader Abrams share just a moment ago, while case rates from the Delta variant are declining, hospitalizations are still high, stressing healthcare systems and revealing concerning disparities between racial groups. The most recent data on COVID hospitalizations shows that Black individuals, represented by the purple line on the graphic, are 2 times more likely than white individuals to be hospitalized. American Indian and Hispanic individuals are also more likely to be hospitalized compared to white individuals. Asian individuals have the lowest rate of hospitalization, which is seemingly due to having the highest rate of vaccination. Within the Asian Pacific Islander population, however, data shows that the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander subgroup has been devastated by COVID-19. So this graph reflects the truism that crises exacerbate disparities. You'll see the gap between racial outcomes increases during the peak pandemic waves, which is noted by the gray bars on the graphic, and then the lines coalesce when overall rates are lower. 8 of the 12 southern states had among the highest pediatric COVID case rates in the nation, which you see in the 2 darkest red shades on the map, with 2 southern states not reporting data on children. Despite confirmed effectiveness, 5 states across the nation have enforced bans on mask mandates in schools, denoted by the X shapes on the map, 2 of those being located in the South. Researchers found that counties without school mask requirements were more than 3 times as likely to have COVID outbreaks than those with mask requirements. While children tend to avoid the worst outcomes from COVID, they can bring it home to their families. 140,000 children have lost a parent or caregiver due to COVID since the pandemic began. Children of color have experienced the majority of these losses.
The South is still down 1.2 million jobs compared to before COVID. Louisiana, in darkest blue on this map, has had the worst job loss rate in the South. While many employers report difficulty finding workers, jobs have still not rebounded to pre-pandemic levels. Instead, workers are quitting at record rates. Although not depicted on this map, Georgia led the South in quits rates in August. Workers are demanding higher wages and better working conditions, and many are retiring early. In addition, nearly 1.2 million parents reported being unable to look for work due to a disruption in childcare, which Alysha will talk about coming up. Increasing the availability of quality, affordable childcare will be essential so parents can get back to work to provide for their children. 7 southern states marked with an X on this map have not adopted Medicaid expansion. So 16% of working age Southerners lack health insurance compared to only 11% elsewhere. The implications of not expanding Medicaid are particularly hard on rural communities. Most of the southern counties with high uninsurance rates are rural. They are the counties in shades of brown on this map. Without Medicaid expansion, rural hospitals don't get enough reimbursement for the care they provide, and many end up closing. In the decade before the pandemic, the majority of rural hospital closures were in the South. For rural Southerners, the distances to getting health care are growing. Rural residents have more untreated health conditions, and COVID death rates in recent months have jumped. In one analysis, a resident of rural Pierce County, Georgia, was 10 times more likely to die of COVID in the most recent surge than an urban resident in Fulton County. Lack of health insurance also means many people incur more medical debt, and this is more severe for Black Americans. About 1 in 4 Black households has medical debt compared to 1 in 5 non-Black households. Climate disasters have compounded the nation's misery this year and last. There have been 18 climate disasters causing at least $1 billion in damages in this year alone, and that's up from an average of 7 between 1980 and 2020. Disasters have been more frequent in the South, such that 68% of Southerners have experienced a disaster since March 2020, compared to just 55% of non-Southerners. Louisiana is red on this map because it has experienced the most disasters, with every county in that state having more than 10 FEMA disaster declarations since March last year. Disasters have been shown to increase inequity. Low-income housing is more likely to be located in vulnerable areas. People in low-income jobs often don't have the savings needed to evacuate or rebuild. And the document-intensive FEMA application process can be too burdensome for smaller municipalities and people with low incomes. This graph shows monthly poverty estimates last year and this year. The top dark blue line represents child poverty. By looking at monthly poverty rates, we can see big dips downward at one time of year when low-income families receive annual child tax credit and earned income tax credit payments. But these sporadic payments make it hard for families to plan for ongoing school, food, or other needs. The American Rescue Plan this year included new monthly child tax credit payments that started in July and have already measurably reduced child poverty down to 11.5% in August. These payments will continue only through December, but may continue longer as part of the American Families Plan, which is currently being debated by Congress.
Childcare disruptions continue to leave families with children under 5 in a lurch, with nearly a third of adults still experiencing a child disruption as recent as September, as you can see on the line graph on the left. In the table on the right, you can see that millions of parents cut work hours, took unpaid leave, and left or lost a job to care for children. Not surprisingly, this all coincides with a drop in women in the workforce. While comprehensive data on childcare closures is hard to come by, data shows that childcare losses impact populations disproportionately. In Jackson, Mississippi, the 5 zip codes that lost the most childcare centers were all majority Black with high poverty rates.
Putting food on the table has been a problem throughout the pandemic as low-income workers suffered heavy job losses. In addition, grocery prices rose 5% over the last year due to supply chain breakdowns. More than 1 in 10 Southern adults reported their families didn't have enough to eat in September. In Louisiana and Mississippi, nearly 1 in 5 adults reported their families went hungry. 39% of Southern adults who are late on housing payments are afraid they will be evicted or foreclosed upon, compared to 32% of non-Southerners. in cities and counties can mitigate a wave of homelessness and instability by enacting one or more ordinances that SEAP has collected. And Alysha is going to put that chat in the link. These ordinances hold landlords accountable for unjust evictions and stop eviction processes when past due rent is paid with reasonable late fees. Now I'll turn it over to Taylor to talk about new data on the LGBT community.
Thanks, Allison. LGBTQIA+ people remain unseen in many official statistics. However, the Census Bureau, through its household pulse survey, is providing needed visibility on the experience of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans people in America during the pandemic. In orange in this graph, we can see that more than half of Southern LGBT adults surveyed experienced anxiety last month, more than twice the rate of non-LGBT adults in the region. In the South, LGBT adults were also more likely to have lost employment income and more likely to have experienced food insecurity than non-LGBT adults. While pre-pandemic research shows that LGBTQ people are more likely to delay medical care because of out-of-pocket cost, the Census Pulse survey found that LGBT adults in the South chose vaccination at a nearly identical rate as non-LGBT people, represented in the blue bars here on the right. Several factors may have influenced this, including previous experience organizing community care as a response to the HIV and AIDS epidemic, as well as government efforts to make COVID vaccinations free and accessible.
More than half of counties nationwide are what experts describe as local news deserts that either have no newspaper or only one, often a weekly or a thinly staffed daily. Counties in the map that are orange represent these news deserts, which tend to be more common in rural areas. 2 out of every 3 southern counties are news deserts. The lack of local news ultimately primes the atmosphere for misinformation to spread rapidly. As the need for local news sources remains critical, many are finding new and unique ways to strengthen their relationships and build trust with the communities they serve. One example of this is Canopy Atlanta, which you can see a screenshot of their website on the right. It's a nonprofit journalism program in Atlanta, Georgia, that partners journalists with local community members to develop and publish stories together. This allows journalists to understand what really matters to the community, and it allows the community members to take ownership of the information they consume. In addition, lack of internet is particularly a problem in rural America. According to the most recent data, nearly half of southern counties have poor internet access, whereas only 16% of counties outside the South have poor access. Once again, orange represents counties that lack internet access, with 25% or more of households reporting no internet access. Just as investments in the US interstate highway system laid the foundation for the American economy from roughly 1960 onward, additional investments in broadband will be needed to lay a solid foundation for America's economy for the 21st century.
Since the start of 2021, nearly 2,500 protests have taken place across the South, occurring in every state. While violent protests commanded the most immediate attention, 99% of these protests in the South were peaceful. From July through September, mask mandates, particularly for school children, catalyzed about 100 anti-mask protests in the South. However, 56 demonstrations in support of mask mandates and stronger COVID protections took place as well, largely on college campuses. Employer vaccine mandates also prompted 79 protests, many among hospital workers. Nearly 80 demonstrations protested police brutality and bias in the justice system. 46 protests were in support of workers' rights, demanding an increase in the minimum wage and better working conditions as a whole. Southerners expressed concern about gun violence through 44 demonstrations. 32 demonstrations took place in support of voting rights, and 21 demonstrations for environmental justice. About 18 protests took place against evictions and substandard housing. In anticipation of the 2020 election and in response to the pandemic, nearly every state did something to make voting easier, such as temporarily expanding access to mail-in voting, establishing ballot drop boxes, or increasing the availability of early voting. Despite concerns that the pandemic might depress voting rates, the voter turnout was at a record high in the 2020 presidential election. Rather than building on this progress made in 2020, Many states have moved to further restrict voting access, and a series of voter restriction laws have been introduced across the country. Since the start of the year, at least 19 states have enacted laws that make it harder for Americans to vote, and half of Southern states have passed restricted voting laws. Lawmakers often cited fraud as a reason for curtailing expansions made during the pandemic, despite expert consensus that there was no evidence of widespread fraud and that it was the most secure election in American history. The 2020 census experienced extreme headwinds, including the pandemic, wildfires, hurricanes, and intense politicization of what should be a non-political process. As a result, this year's redistricting data were delayed by about 4 months before being delivered on August 12th. This graph shows the amount of time that each Southern state has for drawing state legislative and congressional maps. The yellow dots show state legislative districting, and the dark blue dots show congressional districting. States with a green dot, like Kentucky or Georgia, have the same deadline for both. The vertical blue line, around 2.5 months, is where we currently are in the process. Alabama has a deadline for state legislative redistricting that was before the delivery date of data, but every other Southern state has at least 3 months to draw state legislative districts. Southern states have between 4 and 11 months for their congressional districts. As states work within their compressed timelines, it's important that lawmakers aren't tempted to skip transparency and public input. Rebecca DeHart, CEO of Fair Count, will talk more about redistricting and what communities can do to participate in the process later on in today's webinar. And finally, here's our website so you can access the full Pandemic to Prosperity South report, as well as our contact info if you'd like to reach out.
Thank you, Allison, Alysha, and Taylor, for your remarks and your insight. We really appreciate all the links in the chat, so please make sure to click on those, and we will be doing some follow-up information after our webinar today with more info from their team. Thank you so much. A couple of months back, SEAP, along with Groundwork Collaborative and Data for Progress, conducted a survey across the South. Please welcome SEAP's Research Director, Sarah Beth Gale, and Groundwork Collaborative's Michael Mitchell to the stage.
Thanks so much, Jenny. So as Jenny mentioned, SEAP has some partnerships going, and SEAP partnered with Fair Count and NCOC beginning in January of this year on Pandemic to Prosperity South to track the indicators you've just heard about. So we've just heard about the state of the region through data on health and employment and climate. But we also wondered, what are Southerners thinking about these issues? Do they share these concerns? And so we embarked on a new partnership with Groundwork Collaborative to ask Southerners for their opinions on these issues. In September, Data for Progress, in collaboration with us and Groundwork Collaborative, surveyed 2,222 registered voters in the 12 Southern states included in Pandemic to Prosperity South. We'll actually be releasing the full poll results at noon today. So Mike Mitchell with Groundwork and I are here to give you a first look at the results. So just a few takeaways that I'll present, and then I'll hand it over to Mike for a bit of a deeper dive in some of the poll results. But across the 12 states in the American South, a majority of voters support Medicaid expansion and support investing federal aid in pandemic relief and community service programs. Majorities of voters are concerned about climate change, and they feel that extreme weather events have become more common over the last 5 years in their communities. We found that the coronavirus pandemic has negatively affected wages, hours, and debt burden for 1/5 of Southern voters, disproportionately so for voters of color. We also see that voters who receive stimulus payments from the federal government have been positively impacted by the relief funds. I will hand it over to Mike now to talk about this, as well as come back to talk about how this fits into some of the conversations that are happening literally as we speak in Washington, D.C. Mike?
All right. Thanks, Sarah Beth. Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Mike Mitchell. I'm the Policy and Research Director at Groundwork Collaborative, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have the opportunity to dive into what are some really illuminating and I think highly relevant results in a bit more detail. So if we can go ahead to the next slide. When we developed this poll, we wanted to determine the effects of the pandemic on voters across the U.S. South. We wanted to that end to really start, I think, with the economic impact. And one of the first questions that we asked respondents was if they experienced a loss of wages or hours at their job as a result of the pandemic. And as you can see here on this slide, results show that 22% of voters, that's more than 1 in 5 in southern states, have lost either wages or hours due to the pandemic. And you can look across partisan lines. We see that 22% of folks who self-identified as Democrats experienced a loss of wages, 27% of independents, 19% of Republicans. So even across ideology, there's pretty consistent reports of loss in wages and or hours. Across lines of race, people of color were hit especially hard. 44% of Hispanic voters or Latinx voters, 25% of Black voters experienced lost wages when compared also to 20% of white voters. And, you know, obviously those numbers across race for any group are high, but as you can see, there's a little bit of an increase for Black voters and Black respondents, and a much higher response for Hispanic voters. And this, you know, reinforces the fact that as we're thinking about how we design policy that addresses the recovery, that addresses the pandemic, we must continue to center, you know, most marginalized communities who are especially vulnerable to the effects of the pandemic. And, you know, I want to really point out that's through no fault of their own, right? We're talking about structural barriers, both historically and present day, in employment, education, housing, that continue to create, you know, these unfair circumstances for people who are simply trying to make ends meet. Next slide. So this poll also tried to identify Southern voters who are experiencing increased debt burdens as well during the pandemic. If folks are experiencing a loss of wages or a loss of hours, it's entirely reasonable and intuitive that people would either need to dip into their own savings or if they're fortunate enough to have savings, or borrow from family members or take on other forms of debt. And that's exactly what we see. 1 in 5 Southern voters said they experienced an increase in debt during the pandemic. 22% of Black and Hispanic voters, 21% of white voters experienced this increase in debt. And again, just like we saw on the last slide, 20% of Democratic and Republican voters responded this way, and 26% of independents. So we can see that this economic precarity is not an ideological issue, and across the spectrum, families are stretched thin, and that's true both across ideology and race. Go ahead to the next slide. Now, if you think back to the CARES Act, to the American Rescue Plan, one of the key components of both those plans were stimulus payments that individuals received. And if you were an individual adult eligible for the full amount, you could have gotten stimulus payments in an aggregate amount of around $3,200. And so to measure the impact of these payments on voters, the poll identified whether voters had received a stimulus payment or not, and if they had, asked them about what the impact of this. And we found that the stimulus payments had a positive impact on 74% of Southern voters. That's overall, right? 80% of Democrats, 72% of independents, 70% of Republicans reported that these payments had a positive impact on their personal finances. This was especially true for Black and Hispanic voters. The stimulus payments had positive effects for 78% of Black voters, 81% of Hispanic Latinx voters. In comparison, 72% of white respondents reported positive effects. And we can draw from this that, you know, key progressive interventions to provide workers and families the cash supports they needed was an essential lifeline, and it should serve as a model for future progressive policies. And just to put that in a broader perspective, as we were going through one of the most stark economic downturns in recent history, there were also similar reports at this time coming back that poverty was actually going down. And that just shows you how impactful these payments and the full range of supports that were provided through the CARES, American Rescue Plan, and other policy proposals and responses were in staving what could have been catastrophic for many more people had there not been action. So at this point, I'm actually going to hand it back to Sarah Beth for a few more of the results.
Great. Thanks, Mike. You know, I think that the poll showed just the overwhelmingly beneficial nature of those stimulus payments. But there's a lot of these recovery conversations that are continuing right now. So state and local communities have received a portion of the federal dollars from the American Rescue Plan funds, and state and local governments are having conversations about how to spend those dollars over the next couple of years. Congress is currently debating the Build Back Better plan, which includes things like child tax credit extensions, climate action, federal Medicaid coverage for those states that have not expanded Medicaid, as well as debating the federal infrastructure proposal, which also includes climate and disaster proposals. So we wanted to ask Southern voters about several of these. And what we found is broad support for investments focused on people. When asked about how their state should spend federal relief funds from the American Rescue Plan, 71% of Southern voters said they support investing funds in community programs and pandemic relief instead of cutting taxes for corporations and the wealthy. The plan to use relief funds to invest in community services has really strong support across partisan lines. 77% of Democrats, 70% of independents, and 67% of Republicans support investments in community services. As a comparison, less than 10% of Southern voters believe that pandemic relief funds should be used to cut taxes for corporations and the wealthy. And those shares hold across race as well. Next slide. So Medicaid is another recovery conversation as lawmakers in Congress debate expanding Medicaid to the final 12 states, those places where state leaders have so far refused to expand Medicaid over the last decade. And those are overwhelmingly Southern states where that refusal to expand Medicaid has happened. And we heard in the indicators from NCOC the consequences of non-expansion. Southern states have high uninsured rates compared to the rest of the nation. We have more rural hospital closures, lack of access to mental health care, so many different consequences for not expanding Medicaid. And so we asked voters whether or not they support the expansion of Medicaid to cover adults up to age 64 who earn an income at or below 138% of the federal poverty line. And we find that voters support this expansion by a margin of 48 points. 66% support, 18% oppose. Support for Medicaid expansion extends across party lines and across race. We also find strong support for Medicaid expansion when breaking down the results by respondents living in states that have already expanded Medicaid versus those states that have not. So among the expansion states, which are West Virginia, Kentucky, Arkansas, and Louisiana, we find that voters continue to have really strong support for Medicaid expansion by a margin of 52 points. That means that 68% of voters in those states are pro-Medicaid expansion. Voters in states that have not expanded Medicaid are also highly supportive of Medicaid expansion by a margin of 45 points. Mike?
Thanks, Sarah Beth. So keeping in line with the last couple of slides, we see similar results in terms of extreme weather events and climate change. I'm actually going to start on the right side of this slide. When voters were asked whether they agreed or disagreed that extreme weather events have become more frequent or severe in their communities over the last 5 years, by a 45-point margin, voters said that they agree that extreme weather events have worsened in the last 5 years. That's 68 agreeing, 23 disagreeing. And the results were actually overwhelming across party identification. Obviously, Democrats agreed with the statement by a 75-point margin, independents by a 41-point margin, but Republicans said the same by a 24-point margin as well. Meanwhile, Black and Hispanic respondents agreed that extreme weather events have become more severe by a margin of 61 points and 68 points respectively. And this might not be so surprising, as we know that communities of color are disproportionately impacted by climate change and climate catastrophes simply by when we think about housing and geographic segregation and where people have been organized in terms of land and whether or not there's security or safety in that location. In this current political moment, then, I think the failure to incorporate robust and transformative climate investments are more likely to harm Black and brown people first and foremost. And so those numbers that we see there from Black and Hispanic respondents aren't so shocking, but we can also see that white respondents also agreed by a 37-point margin. So again, both across ideology and across race, real sensitivity and understanding that extreme weather events are becoming increasingly an issue. And then this in turn brings us to the other graph here, which is on the left-hand side. As the threat of climate change becomes more salient, we find that more than 2/3 of voters in the South now share this concern, right? This includes 88% of Democrats, 69% of independents. Republicans, meanwhile, are split down the middle on the issue. 50% are concerned about climate change. And we can see some variance across lines of race where Black and Hispanic voters say they're concerned about climate change, but so do 60% of white voters. And then next slide. I know that there is a lot of buzz right now regarding, I know that there's a lot of buzz right now regarding the Build Back Better agenda, what's in, what's out. But these results couldn't be more timely or relevant. If you take anything away from this poll, it should be that there's broad support for historic investments in many of these things. Sarah Beth, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to say or finish up here.
No, just we provided a link and we would love for people to help share these results. We'll be sharing them throughout social the rest of this week. So hope people will amplify them so that folks can hear as they're debating that there really is broad support for these robust investments in climate, health, and community services.
Thank you both so much for that enlightening presentation and for all the results. As mentioned, they have put some links in the chat, but we will also be releasing that information as a follow-up to this webinar. We are very happy to now welcome Rebecca DeHart, the CEO of Fair Count, to talk to us about their next move into redistricting.
Thanks so much, Jenny, for that introduction, and good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here with you today for our last report of Pandemic to Prosperity in the South in 2021 with our partners SEAP and NCOC. Again, I'm Rebecca DeHart. I'm the CEO of Fair Count. Currently, our team is in the thick of redistricting here in Georgia. We're organizing communities across the state, and we're preparing for a special legislative session to begin next Wednesday. And so today I really want to talk about how redistricting is going to play this critical role in recovery from the pandemic, as both direct dollars will be affected, as will every indicator and more that you've heard about today. Next slide, please. Very briefly, as you all know, and you can go ahead and complete the 3 bullets on the slide, redistricting is the process of drawing boundaries for electoral and political districts. But more than just district lines, redistricting will largely impact the resources our communities will receive over the next 10 years, as well as influence the policy decisions and outcomes, both federally and in the state. So one could suppose that fair maps will indicate a fair reflection of the situation and of the needs of the general population, affording each community a direct line to representation who will both listen and act on the desires of the community. On the flip side, unfair maps will not represent communities equally, silencing some over others, inaccurately reflecting the population of the nation and the diversity of needs, while severing that line of communication between communities of need and their representation. Additionally, boundaries from school board to Congress will be drawn, as will voting precincts, which was a direct result of the 2020 census. And that's really important because as you heard about the new voting restrictions imposed in the South earlier in the presentation, they may be compounded by this issue. Next slide, please. As we discussed, it's really important to remember that the timeline for redistricting has been skewed in ways unseen. And we're working from a delayed census as a result of the pandemic. So we actually didn't get the census data until August 12th in a raw form. And then we got it in the full form, which is like an easier to read format for states and local entities to use in mid-September. And now, as we enter late 2021 and we go into 2022, the redistricting processes are beginning across the nation, but they really vary by each state legislature or commission. Next slide, please. As Taylor shared in the report analysis, many Southern states were directly affected by the delayed timelines as their schedule for candidate qualifying and elections were interrupted. But I do want to share that this list is not necessarily complete. Georgia, for example, is a state that is not affected in a way that necessitates legislative change. However, the legislature has indicated their need to rush through the process because of these tighter timelines. This can mean less transparency with maps being considered and less time for public input. In Georgia, public hearings were held in 11 locations and online across the state, but it was before any data came out. No public hearings have been held since the release of the data, nor have any public hearings been held since the first drafts of maps have appeared. So next slide. So what is at stake? Last week, many of us saw the headline in the AJC and in news outlets around the nation that rural Americans are dying of COVID-19 at twice the rate of those in urban environments. Recovery efforts are uneven. Those who have been left behind, underrepresented, and undercounted are at grave risk of falling further. And so this is the point where we ask ourselves, what does the next 10 years of recovery look like? Who is and who will be representing populations that are vulnerable to falling further behind? Will our recovery be equitable? And how much will inequitable maps exacerbate this inequity? The next slide, please. Redistricting has demonstrable impact on the issues and the indicators presented here today and more that you can find in our report. We can see how gerrymandered districts affect children as we realize childcare, education, the tax credits, and other support for families are effective and wildly popular programs that help kids. Yet many politicians oppose strengthening and expanding these programs despite widespread popular support. So how will the allocation of funds impact families with children in crisis due to this pandemic? Top of mind is in Georgia is in Medicaid expansion, as we've mentioned several times already, particularly here as 2 rural hospitals closed during the global pandemic, leaving so many without care. So while Medicaid enjoys and Medicaid expansion enjoys really strong public support, officials in a handful of states, overwhelmingly in the South, are refusing to act in the interests of their own citizens. And many of these states have failed to expand Medicaid because of partisan gerrymandering. In voting rights, gerrymandering can be the most effective weapon of voter suppression we see. Cracking, stacking, and packing district voices are marginalized, diluted, and erased from participatory conversations and actions with direct representation. So as many states are debating their maps, with many others soon to follow, we have to remember that this will be the first redistricting cycle without the protections offered to Southern states by the Voting Rights Act. Preclearance is a thing of the past, absent any federal legislation that will bring it back. So now unfair maps must be tested by Section 2 of the Act, which prohibits every state and local government from imposing any voting law that results in discrimination against racial or language minorities. No longer are we doing it on the front end. It has to happen, and then we have to prove it on the back end. So next slide, please. Which states are most at risk? So because of this, it's no surprise that Southern states are most at risk for gerrymandering. You can go ahead and do the next slide too. Thereby, we're bringing up all of the indicators that we've heard today that are truly specific to the South. True, federal recovery efforts may blanket the nation in many ways, but who will fight for the South? Who will fight for the particular issues, problems, and challenges experienced by Southerners as we make our way through recovery? Who will be listening? This will be decided by the redistricting process. Next slide, please. Redistricting is and should be an act of the people. It shouldn't happen behind closed doors. It shouldn't happen just with policymakers. People should pick their politicians and not the other way around. Yet it is the politicians who draw their own lines and benefit their own parties in most of the Southern states. So how do we hold them to account? Organizing and advocacy is one way. In Georgia, Fair Count has been working around the clock, training communities in community of interest mapping and testimony preparation. We're trying to bring the voices of the people into the conversation at every chance we can. And transparency is paramount. This is important both for communities and for the press. We can't dismiss the guaranteed political manipulation and shenanigans as just politics as usual. Too much is at stake. We can't give them the pass because it's just always been that way. We need to shine a light, and a very, very bright light at that, on the decision makers, using public pressure to force them to account for their actions. Additionally, as funding flows into Southern communities, we have to ensure that there is transparency in where that money is allocated and why. Civic engagement will be more important than ever to ensure federal dollars are used to the greatest impact as we embark on this 10-year process of recovery here in the South. Thank you so much, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Rebecca. We really appreciate that, and we hope that folks get to visit your website to learn more and how they can get more involved in this process. Up next, we have Q&A. If you have a question, feel free to ask in the chat. We want to make sure that we get as many questions as possible. So we want to bring back all of our panelists so that we can have a conversation with them about their presentation and any questions that you all may have. First question. How often will you be updating the indicators report focusing on the South?
I'm happy to jump in here on this one. We were so excited to go into partnership with SEAP and NCOC to create this report this year because, quite honestly, I don't know if there's a more important for us to really be constantly looking at, assessing, and trying to keep up with in real time because, as you know, recovery changes not just year to year, but month to month, week to week, day to day in some places. And so it's really important for us that we are going to continue this report. We're actively seeking support from our funders right now to guarantee that we can continue to bring these indicators and these opportunities and catalysts for advocacy and for getting involved throughout next year as well. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much. Allison, did you want to add anything else?
It's certainly work, as I've said, that's near and dear to our heart, especially the work that we do here in Louisiana. So yes, we also, as I mentioned, will be updating it at least at the national level going forward. So we'll do that for at least another 9 months.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Another question we have here. What can we do particularly about Medicaid expansion?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. So, there's still the opportunity for states to expand Medicaid in those 12 states that have not, 7 of which are in the South. But right now, currently, actually in the Build Back Better plan being debated in DC is a federal fix for that. So basically saying we recognize that state leaders are not going to end the coverage gap for these folks. And so we're going to have a federal fix for it. So it's in the Build Back Better framework that was just released today. So it continues to be in the plan, which is exciting. But for folks who really want to get engaged on that, I want to lift up a group called Southerners for Medicaid Expansion. So there's fantastic advocates in each of these states that are working on this issue day in, day out, organizing around it. and really leading the charge. And they've banded together in this coalition, Southerners for Medicaid Expansion. So the link is now in the chat. So I really encourage folks who are concerned about whether Medicaid expansion is going to stay in Build Back Better, or whether your state leaders are going to engage in it, to visit that website. They have a lot of resources there, as well as ways that you can engage on both the state and federal level.
Thanks so much, Sarah Beth. We have another question here. Please describe any positive experiences in informing and engaging rural communities in the redistricting process. Any lessons learned, specific partners or stakeholders, or the role of business? If you can touch on that, Rebecca.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And please do visit our website, faircount.org, and go to our redistricting link to learn more about our efforts, because we've been working in specifically rural communities on redistricting for the better part of this year. And they've gone exceptionally well. There's even been press, both locally and nationally, that it seems like this redistricting process has more input from advocates and from communities than we've seen, trying to really dismantle sort of the the esoteric level of redistricting and bring it down to communities where they really feel the impacts. And the pandemic has been a really large driver of this, particularly in rural communities. So we have organizers on the ground across the state in rural communities, but we're also accessing online ways of sharing information. So at Fair Count, for instance, we partnered with the Princeton Gerrymandering Project to create communities of interest maps. At this point, I believe we've broken 225 maps that we've created in rural areas, where we've invited community members to sit down and look at their community. Where do they grocery shop? Where is your faith institution? Where are your schools? What is it that brings your community together? And how would that be impacted if lines were drawn through it in order to silence that community? Those maps we'll be doing more with next week, so please keep an eye on our Twitter feed as we release some of those. We've also really encouraged testimony writing. There's not a lot right now in the advanced stages of redistricting to hold people to account, except the power of the public itself to mitigate any sort of impending disaster. So the more we can engage people, encourage them to write testimony that is part of the public record, get them ready to testify at the Capitol, get them ready to stand up for their communities, has been really important. And we have found that overwhelmingly, people want to participate in redistricting. In fact, when we put out the call for volunteers in rural areas, we were overwhelmed with how many people were ready to stand up and were ready to fight. So people are listening and they're ready to move this forward. So much is at stake and we all feel it.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And one more question about redistricting. With the delay in census data, how will that affect local redistricting?
That's such a good question that I can jump in on that too, because sometimes local redistricting is done separately from that of congressional and state ledge. And also sometimes congressional and state ledge get all the attention, all the bells and whistles, but local redistricting is just as important. In Georgia, it won't be done at this special session. It'll be done in the regular legislative session this spring. And we also know that so many Voting Rights Act violations have happened on the local level, but there hasn't been enough attention to really hold them to account. I would say that local redistricting is absolutely more important than ever. And one of the biggest reasons for that is because of the pandemic. Particularly in the South, we have seen governors shirk their responsibility and their duties in either protecting using virus mitigation efforts like masking or vaccine mandates or other things, keeping their entire state safe, and instead have kicked them down to the county level representatives to make these decisions. And then when they do make the decisions, they may be picking a fight with their own governor. This is absolutely tragic, but it also has really bolstered how important local representation is in every county in the South, and that those lines be drawn fair to ensure that all communities there are getting equal access to being heard.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Do we have any other final thoughts from any of our panelists that they'd like to share as we close out today's meeting?
I would just like to go first real quick, because I did see any role of business and I do want to address that. Absolutely. Businesses have everything at stake, especially local businesses and rural communities, as they think about what this recovery is going to look like for the next 10 years. Those indicators were so clear with lost wages, lost hours, with unemployment. And also the census itself directs funding, not just through governmental programs, but is really the data set that new opportunities for people who are developing economic opportunities and development within communities. They look at that census data in order to determine whether or not a community is right for them to invest in or to grow in or to open a grocery store in, in a grocery desert. So businesses has everything at stake, and businesses are sort of proven that business is better in places that aren't highly gerrymandered. It's really good when we have competition and everything gets centered a little bit more in our states. And thank you so much for having me here today. That's all.
Thank you, Rebecca. Anybody else want to have some final thoughts?
Just jump in and say that we'll be sending, again, a downloadable spreadsheet of all of the data in the Pandemic to Prosperity report to all the attendees today. That'll come out in a few days. And really encourage you all to take that data, use it for making the arguments in your local communities about a lot of the topics that we've talked about today, and the great policies and other advocacy tools that the folks at SEAP are putting forward.
Thank you so much. Sarah Beth?
Yeah, and I just want to echo everyone. Thank you all so much for being here today, and really excited to get both data and poll results out to folks, because we know that these issues matter in our community. Sometimes people think, oh, well, that's an East Coast or a West Coast issue, but 2/3 of voters in the South are caring about health, Medicaid expansion, and climate. And what happens in their communities and their community services. And so really want to amplify that message as much as possible, that these are our concerns, and that these issues matter to us, and we expect action and leadership on them. So thank you again for being here. Thank you to Mike with Groundwork Collaborative. It's been fantastic to partner with them on this, and look forward to releasing the poll results in 1 minute.
Thank you all so much for being here and for joining us. We appreciate your insight and partnership to NCOC, Fair Count, Groundwork Collaborative, Data for Progress. We want to give a special shout out to John for running today's slides. And thank you for being a part of this special moment. Please make sure you are following all the organizations on social media. For you all who joined us today, you will be added to SEAP's listserv to keep you updated of future events and programming. We appreciate the attention and support for all of our Pandemic to Prosperity programs this year. When asked what our goal of this program would be, this last one, put simply, is to get to prosperity as soon as we can and leave the pandemic in the past. To you and yours, we wish you a great and healthy rest of the year. Be safe, and thank you, and have a great day.